This week I'm going to continue my exploration of how you can use the running stitch in very practical and creative ways, and we're going to be looking at something called Sashiko, but in my own rather irreverent way. Sashiko is a Japanese style of using the running stitch in long rows that end up creating these rather fabulous patterns. And here's an example of my attempts to do some free-form sashiko without any planning, but it's actually a lot easier to do it with some sort of guidelines or marks to guide your stitches. And let me show you how I make my marks. I use this thing that is actually an embroidery tool. It's something called plastic canvas, and it's meant for stitching on for making embroidered objects. But as you can see, mine has been used for other crafting purposes. And I've discovered that if I want to make my stitches fairly precise, this is the tool that I use. And here I am making a dot in every other square rather than every square. I find every square makes really small stitches. So what do you do if you don't happen to have a plastic canvas at home? You can definitely buy pre-printed templates, but look around your house, you might find something. I found the strainer in my kitchen, and I think that could make some really interesting patterns there. So some of my dots went a little bit off kilter there, and that's not a big deal. I just added a few more in, and I know which dots I'm using, and I'll ignore the other ones. And Sierra says, just don't ignore me. So I'm going to get started by doing a fairly simple sashiko pattern that's really the basis for many other patterns. It's these X's or crosses, and all of these other patterns here start with the same base of these crosses like this. So let me show you how to make those stitches. In very traditional sashiko, you would load up lots and lots of stitches on your needle and then pull it all the way through using a very long needle. I don't have a long needle. I'm using what I happen to have at home. And now you may have watched my last video where I used some pre-printed cloth to create designs. And you'll notice that this is fairly similar to what I did on the piece of cloth with the dots on it, except this is going straight up and down rather than an angle. And I had mentioned last time I was having a difficult time figuring out how things worked on the diagonal for some reason. So I find this actually a lot easier for me to see where to place my next stitch. You notice that they're offset from each other, so the stitches don't line up from row to row. And then once I've done all my stitching in one direction, I will go back and add the stitches in the other direction, and they will just cross over the stitches that there were before. So I am going to continue across this row, adding X's, and you can see how this is different than a more traditional counted cross stitch where you would finish one little cross stitch at a time before going on to the next ones. And I'm doing a fairly small area here, but you can do a whole cloth in these stitches if you want. And if you were to make a kitchen towel, for example, that was covered in stitches like this, the stitches or the floats actually make the towel more absorbent than just the plain cloth on its own. And you might notice that there's another pattern there over on the left-hand side. So that is actually a pattern that I figured out how to do for myself. And that's the bonus that I'm going to be sharing with my Ko-fi supporters this week. My Ko-fi subscribers get early access to my videos, and they usually have some bonus content that I don't always share on the public YouTube channel. So I'd love to have you join us over there if you feel inclined. So now let's see how we can use our base off those cross stitches to create other patterns. Like I mentioned, there are quite a few other patterns that we can create with our basic grid of crosses here. Now let's see. I would start now doing diagonal stitches. I'm going from the tail off each of those crosses to the next one. In that first row, things got a little bit muddled. I wasn't really quite sure what I was doing, but I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not going to bother to take it out. Doesn't make the piece any less functional. It just makes it a little bit less regular. And I will remind you of the Saori quote here. Consider the difference between something made by a human and something that's made by a machine. And this is one of the slogans of the Japanese Saori weaving tradition, and I think it's very appropriate here as well. So now that I've worked out where my stitches are supposed to go, I'm creating this rather interesting pattern that I quite enjoy. So the stitches go from the end of one of the legs of the X to the next leg in the next X. And then when you get to the end of the row and you turn around, you make sure that your stitches line up with the stitches from the previous row. And I will continue on with this pattern until I don't feel like doing it anymore. And then I might decide to do something else. Of course, you can use any of these patterns to add patches or mend your clothing. I will warn you though, if you let the visible mending get out of hand, you might find that you end up with a pair of trousers that look something like this. And I can tell you that I worked on these starting in 2020, and in 2023 they were still not finished, and it was my 100-day project to finish stitching all of those patches on there. So 100 days plus. So now I'm going to switch things up and change the placement of my diagonal stitches. So instead of connecting from the point of each X to the next one, I'm going from the center where the X's cross to the center of the next X. And this gives a completely different look than the previous stitch. I think they're both really interesting. And once I finish doing this in one direction, I'll turn things around to 90 degrees and go back in the other direction. And it creates this really cool quilted look. And I'm just quite amazed at all the different patterns that you can find once you start exploring the possibilities with the running stitch here. So there are 2 more patterns, and like I mentioned, I'll show my Ko-fi supporters how to do that 3rd pattern there as well. And for this week's contribution to my year-long project, I'm going back to work on the spotty side of my cloth again. And this time I've decided that I'm going to work in a straight line using the pink spots as my guide. And pro tip here, if it looks like your thread has knotted up, sometimes it's just twisted. And if you very carefully, very gently pull the threads apart, you can get it untangled without ending up with a big knot. Doesn't always work, but it's worth giving it a try. So I did that cross pattern that I've done a few times now, but by working with the spots on the back of the cloth, you don't see them at all on the front of the cloth. And I made a little bit of a mistake and managed to stitch over one of the flowers on the front of the cloth here. I'm going to leave it as it is, and that's it for this video. Maybe you'd like to watch another video in my series on the running stitch. Thanks for watching, and I hope I've inspired you to make something beautiful. Bye for now.